everyone to our 16th, I don't know, whatever, the newest edition of the Enduring Planet and Friends Finance series. We have a really great session today for you on working with EPCs. This is the first of two sessions that we'll be producing on this topic. So this is the first one. The next one will probably be in maybe August or October. Just as a reminder, so this series exists for all of you. We produce these events once a month. Every time we focus on a tactical or actionable sort of niche topic in the finance and kind of climate nexus. The goal for these events is to be very practical for you as the attendees. So we not only do we try to tailor the questions that we have prepared for the panelists to that effect, but also we would really love it if you could be very active in the chat. What we'll do is either the speakers or I will be responding to chat in real time, and then Hannah, as a moderator today, will also bring some of those questions into the discussion as we go. So I will let the speakers introduce themselves in just a moment. I'm Dmitry Gershenson. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Enduring Planet. We are one of the two kind of co-organizers together with Hannah and Lupine of this series. And maybe just a quick intro for us. We do two primary things in the climate ecosystem. We are a lender, so we provide debt financing to climate companies that have creditworthy contracts, grants, procurement, commercial contracts. It doesn't matter. We're very interested in all of those. And then we also provide fractional financial services to climate companies. So we own the finance back office today for almost 90 clients in the ecosystem across startups, small businesses, nonprofits, and even later stage companies. So with that, I will hand it over to our illustrious moderator today. And for the first time in a while, I think I will be off. So I'll be lurking in the background. Thank you.
Thanks, Dimitri. And I'm so privileged to be joined by a powerhouse panel today. So I'll make the intro quick. Most of you know me. I'm Hannah at Lupine Finance. I work as a fractional CFO across half a dozen climate tech companies and work with about half a dozen advisors to help those companies navigate these various challenges of going from equity audiences to infrastructure audiences and everything that it takes to get there. Today, this session has been brought about because Dimitri and I are putting our heads together with Dave. We've been asked this question so many times, and on this particular topic, people have wildly different opinions about how to use EPCs, when to use EPCs, and typically very piping hot opinions about when it works and when it doesn't. So we're going to make this a two-part series, and today is really, again, what does it look like when it works? Let's get the perspectives from people who have been at and around EPCs for their entire careers and have been building projects hand in hand with them. And next, we will flip the lens and get a little bit of a counter consensus view on how to deviate and what those trade-offs actually look like. So stay tuned for future events. Today, I would like to have Court introduce himself from the New Industrial Corporation. Then we'll go over to Tom over at Antora Energy and Sunil at Fluor.
Great. Thanks, Anna. Nice to meet everyone. My name is Court Horne. I'm a founding partner at New Industrial Corporation. Brief blurb about New Industrial. We are a tech investor that focuses on making a small or modest VC investment, originally to align with the startup company we're looking to work with. But our ultimate goal is to help them commercialize their first project. So we'll lead and help through the development efforts, both in pre-development, development through construction, and staying involved into operations. Our overall role helps structure the debt, structure the EPC contract or DBA, and we'll save that for part two, as well as provide the project equity required under a project finance model. Thanks, Anna.
Awesome. Tom?
Awesome. I'm Tom Bence. I lead project execution at Antora Energy. So Antora Energy delivers affordable, reliable energy for industry and data centers at the speed and scale required for the demand. I lead specifically pre-FID, so pre-financial investment decision through handover to commissioning operations. I'll be representing the and a startup founder perspective and owner operator for this panel today. So excited to participate. And yeah, I do have the unique experience or background of having started my career in the working at an EPC. So have both sides of the fence represented in some respects on this panel.
Thanks, Tom. Sunil?
Cool. Thanks, Tom. I'll send all the hard questions to you then, since you worked at an EPC. I'm Sunil Vyas, based in Southern California. If you heard, I've been at Fluor 26 years. Background as a process engineer for the first half of my career. Then worked in corporate strategy for 7, 8 years. Now it's been about 5 that I work in our incubation team that looks to partner with startup tech companies as a EPC scale-up partner. I am also a CCUS subject matter expert for the company, so I get involved in various strategies and specific pursuits with respect to CCUS. Hopefully you all know what Fluor is, but we're a global tier 1 EPC, and we'll get into what that actually means. But we've got over 20,000 employees, offices pretty much all over the globe, headquartered in Dallas, 15-ish billion revenue in 2025. Yeah, I'll stop there. Pass it back to you, Hannah.
Amazing. Thanks, Sunil. And we've got really the kind of full house here, right? Like big tier 1 EPCs on one end, founders building projects in real time, and Court financing them and helping negotiate and manage the development process, and investing. Great crew. We're going to start with some definition setting. I'm sure plenty of this room knows this, but it's worth repeating and having recorded for posterity. So out to the basics. Sunil, like, define EPC and typically the scope that you provide.
Sure. So EPC stands for engineering, procurement, and construction. Engineering can mean a lot of different things. You can start at very early stage conceptual engineering, which involves some optimization and study work, all the way through the FEL 1, 2, 3 process until you get to detailed engineering. And I'm happy to talk through a little bit more about what each of those means. Procurement and construction procurement is when you're actually buying equipment and materials. And being a global EPC, we have a specific group that deals with procurement because you can imagine we buy a lot of materials and a lot of equipment, so we can buy them in bulk. We can get them, we can get better pricing because we have the ability to do that. That's procurement. Construction is construction. You're building the facility. You're integrating all the different pieces. We're oftentimes doing commissioning, startup and commissioning as well. I would say historically, about 80% of our revenue comes from the PC, and about 20 comes from the E. Engineering work does have a higher margin than procurement and construction, but there is a difference in 80-20 is a pretty big difference. If you're familiar with ENR, used to be a magazine, now I guess it's just a website, Engineering News Record. Every year they put out a top design companies and top contracting companies. So that's basically the top engineering firms and the top construction firms in the US. So if you've never seen those lists, I would recommend that you go take a look, because you'll see who the top engineering companies are and who the top construction companies are. And then you'll find the companies that are EPCs, you'll probably find them on both lists, but you'll see, I gave you the 80-20 split, but for other EPCs, you'll be able to tell, what their split looks like. And then of course there are companies who do engineering only, and you'll find them on the engineering list. Excuse me. And then there are companies who do construction only, and you'll find them on the construction list. Does it make sense for me to go through like kind of different phases of engineering because I think that might be relevant here.
I think that would be totally helpful. And Court, I'm going to ask you to overlay after that and talk about what do you need to see from those different engineering stages in thinking about financing. But yes, please, Sunil.
Okay, so let's start with what we call FEL1, which is generally a feasibility study or a conceptual design. To do an FEL1, we don't need a whole lot of information. We can even do it site agnostic. Like there doesn't have to be a specific site selected. We can get by with just knowing the region that it's in. But we do need to know capacity, the different process units that are there. So we'll do some minimal engineering deliverables for an FEL1, culminating with typically what we call class 5 cost estimate, which is about plus or minus 50%. After an FEL1 comes an FEL2, which is generally, we call it a pre-feed. So in this stage, we'll do slightly more engineering work, culminating with a class 4 usually estimate, which is slightly tighter accuracy range than a class 5 from an FEL1. And then after FEL2 comes an FEL3, which we generally call a feed. So there's a much longer list of engineering deliverables that we do. Here in the feed stage is when we start estimating actual quantities of things, whereas in FEL1 and 2, we're kind of using factors, historical factors that we have access to because we've done this many times. When you get to feed, we're actually calculating certain quantities. In the feed phase is when you want it to be site specific. So then we're going to want to see details of the site. We're going to want to know, is it brownfields, meaning is there an existing facility there that we're building next to, but maybe we can tap into some of the utilities there. Or is it greenfield, meaning is it just open land? So all those things we're going to want to know. And when you start the feed phase, you really want that design basis to be pretty solid. You don't want to have any, start doing the feed and then all of a sudden we're like, no, we want to change this, because then we have to restart the work. So each of these phases, as you progress through them, there's more engineering deliverables, which means a longer schedule, which also means more costs that we're going to charge you to do that work. After feed, generally is when you hit the final investment decision stage, FID, which is when our client needs to figure out how are they going to pay for this. And quite frankly, that's where a lot of projects struggle, especially in the climate space. But let me back up a little bit. Why do we have all these different phases? Why don't we just go straight into it? Let's just do all the engineering in one shot and build it. We generally have these phases because there are decisions that need to be made at in between each of the phases, and oftentimes those are investment decisions. We're giving cost estimates at the end of each phase. So for a client, is that cost what you were expecting? Is it 2 times what you're expecting? Is it 3 times what you're they need to make those decisions, and that's why we have these that's why we have these different phases, is for people to make decisions. Then so FID, and then you move into what's called the detailed engineering phase, which is where that's where you're engineering every single piece of equipment, every single pipe, every single instrument. And during that phase is when procurement can start. You can actually start procurement even earlier, but if you want to make sure that you have the money to build the project. Procurement starts. You start going out for firm pricing for equipment. You start getting firm pricing from subcontractors, and then you start prepping the site for construction, and then you just kind of flow through construction. So I wanted to set the stage a little bit because I think we're going to be probably talking about FEL 1, 2, 3 EPC phase, and I think that's important to just set the stage for our discussion.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Sunil, because that really helps lay out the framework and, kind of layering onto that. Typically, when we're starting to work with a startup company, I always treat it as FEL1 is almost like your initial owner program. And that's really defining the technologies you want for your process, answering those key decisions that if you didn't give engineers some parameters, they could run wild with and frankly lead down a bad path. FEL2 is really laying the framework for how you want to structure your agreement with a contractor that you're working with and that approach. Hannah, to address your original question around where does financing come in, that could be really nuanced based on a couple different factors. The biggest being risk transfer, and that's what I'll probably spend the next 90 minutes talking about. So I won't go down too much of that path. But really, I kind of break it down into two buckets of how these projects are financed. There is growth equity financing or debt that's been raised on a topco startup entity. Those, it's really up to the startup and the equity investors on when they want to ultimately lock in a project and do that. Full transparency, I would never do that before an FEL2 in any scenario. The other side is project financing, and I know that's what we want to spend some time today talking about. That approach, if you're doing a traditional project finance model, and I can go into that in a moment of what that kind of means. That again, depending on the risk transfer, really you need to get to an FEL3 at a minimum. Anything before that, I wouldn't put project equity into. What really defines those two different phases is a project finance model is ultimately raising the debt and putting the equity directly on a project. So raising a special purpose vehicle that then funds that project. And that project effectively sits sheltered from your startup. The lenders you use for that are very different than private credit you would maybe raise on your own. So a lot of the startups on here are probably familiar with like USDA-backed loans, those kind of programs that sit on your top co. This is directly on the project and is typically your larger banks under a much more rigorous process. What lenders are looking for, which ultimately guides what equity is looking for, is understanding and capping the risk associated with unknowns. Not everything can always be arranged. I know Sunil will touch on process risk insurance, and there's unforeseen conditions in geotechnical. There's all these other conditions, but ultimately they're trying to find a way to cap that and have somebody carrying either insurance, appropriate risk transfer to a large contractor like Fluor that has the balance sheet, or contingencies that are carried directly in the project model. So you kind of run across these different phases, but it ultimately comes down to that risk transfer of where we can get comfortable with a level of design for financing and to move that forwards. I would say for the majority of the conversation here, because we're looking mostly at project finance models, because that's typically the way to get out of the valley of death as a startup. You're going to need to get to an FEL3 with a contractor that is supportive of a risk transfer and has the balance sheet to support the risk transfer you're contemplating.
Court, there's so much good content in there. I'm definitely going to come back. Our next section is going to be a bit about timing and like when to engage all these different pieces and like how to get your investor to speak with your EPC, or what do you need to show of the depth of your conversations with your EPC to investors. So we're going to come back to that. But Tom, I want to come to you a bit quickly about what are some of the common misconceptions that operators often think an EPC will do in everything that Sunil just laid out, but then they don't actually do? Or what do they assume they need to handle that actually an EPC can help them with that's overlooked?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So when you engage with an EPC, you're likely only really engaging in the engineering portion, especially from like FEL 0 through FEL 2. You may start to engage with the P and the C and starting in FEL 3 and really validating your estimates. But when you really start that engagement, you're working with them to define the options and the architecture for your plant. What you're not getting in a lot of cases, which some firms and reference the ENR. There's some firms that give a full wrap, but a lot of firms aren't going to help you as much with interfacing with the financiers, getting their requirements understood. They're a major stakeholder in this process. Your permit matrix you're going to want to utilize external parties to help define that, but in a lot of ways you want to own that and make sure that your team is fully comfortable with it. You can have support in submitting those, but a lot of engineering partners may be limited in the level of who at the end of the day is signing those and officially putting information. As a startup, you may be having a black box in a way where you're integrating your product into those permits that you're submitting, and you really need to be involved in understanding the requirements around that, especially if you have a bespoke product that you're integrating or a first of a kind technology that you're integrating. And then the third item is insurance. You want to understand the required project insurance to execute your project. Typically, that is held by the owner or the project company, as Court was referring to, that you're going to move this, develop this under, and you need to understand what they're going to require, and that will really be an input to the EPC partner that you select. They may need to hold certain insurance coverages, and it's really a prerequisite to engaging with the EPC is understanding what insurance requirements are required for your builders all risk or even your engineering design contracts.
That's helpful, Tom. Give us a picture into like how that typically works. So like, when you say engage an EPC, do you start conversations and use exploratory questions to figure out what types of risk the EPC is willing to cover? And for this audience, can you define what a full wrap means versus what does the timeline look like if you need to go source outside insurance? How do you kind of do that in tandem? Do you do that before you engage the EPC fully? Do your insurers need to know who the EPC is going to be? How does that chicken and egg work?
Yeah, you really should be developing a project execution plan in the early stages. So when we talk FEL 1 and FEL 2, when you're maybe at even 10% engineering, you should develop a plan of how you're going to evaluate your partners. Really, these partners are extensions of your company. I view all of our insurance partners, our engineering EPC partners as really extensions of our company during the execution of the project. So you're getting comfortable around them, and then you're sharing them with all the stakeholders. So certainly the financier is going to be a lot more comfortable with a tier one EPC versus somebody that may be more esoteric and maybe more focused on a specific edge case technology that a startup may be working with. So you definitely want to get their buy-in to them, and you want to be kind of communicating on all fronts early in the project, as early as FEL 0, getting folks documenting a project execution plan that then you're sharing with your financiers, your insurance companies, and even sharing that with your EPC for feedback and getting their buy-in to make sure that they're comfortable with the approach that's being taken on the project.
Awesome. Very helpful. Court, maybe back to you and to give us a bit here into timeline. So there are some permutations in which founders can split the E versus the PC, right? They could work with a Fluor and use just the PC once they've worked with an engineering design firm or done some of that in-house. How do you evaluate the risks between kind of coordinating those two things off from the investor's seat? And what would you typically recommend? Is there efficiencies by doing that all in-house with one entity?
Yeah, there definitely is. And I wouldn't say it's so much a risk to lenders, it's more a risk that a EPC contractor is willing to take on. So, a lot of the startups that are on this call or that we've worked with, they've already done some engineering in their pilot plants and their other designs, and they'd ideally like to keep working with that engineer because they're familiar with their process. That is great for defining owner requirements to ultimately work through and finding the right engineering contractor team, whether that's a tier one EPC that can do both functions, or if that's a general contractor that is partnering up through a design services agreement with an engineering firm to ultimately deliver an EPC contract. Where we always like to caution is you don't want to continue design with an engineering partner that either doesn't have their own balance sheet that's sufficient for a contractor, or that you've sort of vetted with contractors. You can work with an engineering firm that seems really great, but they're not willing to sign up to a design services agreement that a contractor requires to ultimately deliver an EPC. And what you end up having is a lot of design rework and validation. Ultimately, under a risk transfer, you're asking the EPC contractor to take on design risk for your plant, whether that's just the balance of plant and not touching the process. They're trying to integrate all your equipment. They're trying to sort out designing a facility to meet the codes and requirements in the applicable area. But to do that, if you advance too far along in your engineering design with somebody else, a contractor doesn't come in and say, "We'll just take that as gospel and we'll novate that design into our contract." They'll either say, "Great, you own the design up to this point," which creates a problem for lenders, or they'll say, "We need to, do our own engineering validation and innovation." So I typically look at this when I'm working with a startup on, you need some level of engineering to ultimately define what you're looking for, to garner market interest from EPCs that might want to do your work or not. To Sunil's comment on, an FEL1, knowing the size of the contractor you want to work with. If you've got a $25 million build, maybe Fluor isn't interested, but you have a $300 million build, you can't work with a local contractor because they don't have the balance sheet to support it. So you need to do all those functions, but at a certain point and earlier, you're going to want to have a contractor engaged with their engineering, even if their involvement is really just minor oversight during that engineering phase, because you're trying to line up an EPC contract for the future. And, we touched a little bit on misconceptions, and Tom went through a lot of those buckets, and they're all real buckets. The other side of this is we always have to look at risk doesn't go away. We're just trying to put risk on the appropriate party. If a company or an owner is trying to put risk where it doesn't belong, contractors aren't going to sign up for it. And somebody always has to sign up to the other side of the deal. So their involvement earlier can determine that. But I do like to always raise with contractors, what engineering firms would you work with? Even if it's too early for them, generally we have contractors in mind based on regionally what you're building and what type of asset you're building. A lot of times I'll reach out to them and say, we have this project coming down the pipeline. It's probably not ready for you yet. What engineering firms would you recommend that we look to engage with, that they have good relationships with, so that we can do a bit of work and know that there's a good chance we can novate the engineering firm over to the contractor? Doesn't always work. I wish I could say it 100% works. It doesn't. That's where the Fluors of the world really excel, in that they can cover both sides of it. But sometimes you are looking for that smaller contractor for a smaller project that has just a bit more of that feel to it. So overall, lenders aren't going to really drive on that. Lenders are just going to come back to the risk transfer that ultimately is in the contract that gets signed. The best way to mitigate that is to make sure that the contractor can take the appropriate risk you're looking for. Tom touched on it. One of the first things I do with every contractor is lay out key terms that I would need in an engineering procured contract. There's a misconception that an engineer procured contract just covers all the risk, or the idea of turnkey, which I really don't like that term when it comes to it. Sunil will touch on, there's a whole bunch of risk Fluor wouldn't even take. And that totally makes sense for a first of kind facility. But there's other conditions like security packages, liquidated damages, schedule certainty, all these other functions that are good to get up in front of the table early on, even just in a simple table format, to see if the contractor can do that. And our side, a lot of what I do here is say, okay, we also need to get the financials for that contractor to make sure that even if they're willing to sign up to this, that their balance sheet can support what they're signing up for. So.
And just a quick clarification on terminology here. I super appreciate that answer, Court. When you talk about contractor, you're really talking about everyone who will do P and C, right? The procurement and the construction. And it could be a large tier one like Fluor, or it could be, like you said, more of a regional player who maybe specializes in that. Is that right?
Generally, yes. The P always becomes the challenge. So, Sunil probably is best placed to talk on this, but a contractor that builds your project is very familiar with working with subtrades and mechanical, electrical, plumbing, all these different disciplines. And they have equipment like HVAC equipment, and they're used to buying that. And if that subcontractor is falling over, they're quick to pivot to another subcontractor who can do that. Where the P becomes challenging is when you have specialty equipment that's specific to your process. Not every vendor you work with is going to have the relationship with the contractor. The contractor doesn't necessarily have a long history with that vendor, and it being a specialty piece of equipment becomes a challenge in that if that vendor is falling short on their obligations, it's very difficult for a contractor to pivot and find an immediate replacement and still meet their schedule, because ultimately contractors are looking to fulfill their schedule obligations as they continue through this along with budget. So sometimes the procurement still will reside with an owner, or there's a risk transfer there, and that's probably one of the biggest sticking points is around that specialty equipment, whether it's the process, the schedule, or the design integration risk, because all three of those kind of play into each other.
Roger. Okay. I think it's worth noting for this audience, I'm going to try not to touch on it too much today, but there are many moving stakeholders, even just embedded with these many relationships, right? I'm hearing things like you can have an owner's engineer who could be some type of engineering design service, who could work with an EPC or some other entity in engineering that provides worthy, viability to the contractors. And you could potentially have contractors or work with an EPC who does the procurement well in addition. And so within that, all of them are managing scopes, schedules, budgets, and to Tom's point earlier, vetting all of those entities and comparing them apples to apples is almost more than a full-time job. And that project management role in the project developer's position is not represented in this panel here today, but it is crucially important. And I think you're all hearing from the audience how many variables need to be kept spinning on plates at the same time. And there are entities out there who do that and specialize in that well. If that's of an interest in future sessions, you can let Dimitri and I know, and maybe we'll wrangle together some smart folks to talk about all of those different stakeholders and how they're herded like cats. In the meantime, I want to answer a few questions in the chat and bring it back to Sunil about, all right, first of a kind is often, relevant to this audience. It's where this is stickiest and where these decisions are hardest to discern how to make. Timelines can be very long. I was answering a chat question that this could be between 12 to 18 months at best, right? And that's kind of speedy. Sunil, what are you seeing from timelines, and more talk to us from the early innings? How soon should a founder or founding team approach you? What is too small to be small for Fluor? You do a lot of work in business incubation and helping with these early FEL designs. And what is like best in class if a founder were to come up to your door and say, here's what we've got, here are the materials, the data room that you could really dig into and get working on?
So how small is too small is the question that we get all the time in our incubation group. I guess just to be frank, pilot size, we can offer early stage engineering, so FEL 1 or 2-ish. But for that capacity, going beyond that doesn't really make sense for us because number one, we're probably not going to be cost effective compared to your other options. Number two, we like to build big stuff, and building small stuff is not really in our wheelhouse. So we can engage, and we have engaged as early as pilot stage, or even we've talked to companies who are pre-pilot just to begin the conversation. As you progress from pilot to pilot, maybe demo, maybe commercial demo, we'll maybe still offer the same kind of package. Like we'll do FEL 1, FEL 2, and then recommend that they pass it to like a fabricator who can finish the work and actually build it in their shop. But once you start getting in larger capacities, I'm just going to throw 50 to 100-ish million, then we start that's when we will start thinking about, okay, maybe it makes sense for us to start doing the feed. If you start getting, even above that, depending on the location, then doing the PC um, may start to it starts to make more sense the larger the capacity and the larger the total installed cost is. So it's not we're not going to we do engage in early stages, but we understand that being competitive at those small scales is actually harder for us.
Fair enough.
And
And Jennifer's asking some questions here about like, what are some of the data points? Let's say we could get past the pilot, right? And they've done it with the fabricator. What are some of the data points that you really need from those pilots or demonstrations to get to the next for full commercial? Maybe you can answer that. And then Tom, I'd love to hear your perspective about how Antora managed some of that. I know you have a unique case study.
yeah, I think what we would need from the technology company is information related to their tech. And so presumably you're scaling up, right? And you had a pilot or a demo, and now you want to scale up to some other capacity, 50x or 10x or something. We're going to want to know what's the scale up strategy for your proprietary equipment. Like, what does it look like? You built it at demo. What does it look like now at 50x? Are you just, let's say you have a catalyst and you have a reactor in your demo, can you just build one big reactor now at 50x scale, or do you need to have 10 operating in parallel? So we're going to need some guidance on what scale up looks like, and then just guidance on design inputs for the proprietary pieces of equipment. And also, understanding, assuming you have a feedstock and a product, what are the other process blocks that need to sit around your technology? We're going to want to know, or we can work together to figure out what those process blocks are, what they need to do, and then figuring out balance of plant. That's something that we can do to help support the technology company. But really, I mean, we just want the technology company to focus on their technology and give us design inputs and scale up inputs for what it looks like at the larger capacity, and then generally we can fill in the rest of the pieces to come up with an overall design and cost.
Yeah, that aligns well with our process, and I'd say Antora is aligned in a unique position where our product is modular. It's built for the speed of an integration, so we can easily partner with a EPC, a new EPC partner even, and provide, hey, here's the structural requirements to support our module. Here is how we connect power to it. Here is the piping and process interfaces for it. And as soon as you provide that information and you lock those interface points, being structural, mechanical process, and electrical, any engineering partner, you're really unlocking them to go forth and design that balance of plant for a specific industrial partner. At Antora, at our Big Stone project, we had a great customer being Poet for that project, and we were able to use an execution strategy that partnered very well with them. But I'd say that for our other projects in development, we're deploying different execution strategies just based on the specific industry partner and also the specific regional contractors that and relationships that we've built for these other projects. So it is really an execution strategy. If you have a modular assembly that you're integrating into a larger system, and you have that very well defined, you can have the flexibility to make improvements within the battery limits of your product that you're providing to an EPC, while keeping those interfaces locked is really key to working well with an EPC, while also staying nimble as a startup and developing and improving your product continuously. So that's how we we at Antora achieve that.
That's super helpful. I think that's like the core tension that most founders feel is like there's so much iteration and product development happening in the process of working toward that 12 to 18 month cycle of, getting the project built. Very hard to keep that completely static and those interfaces fully locked, but that's really what causes a lot of the headaches. Tom, tell us a little bit more about this partner. Is the partner that you worked with, you're using your customer's EPC? Like, how did that evolve? Was that a requirement of your customer in order to get you toward that offtake? And then I'd be curious, Court's opinion on how that makes something more or less financeable, if at all.
Yeah, for the specifics around the arrangement for that, we in partnering with whether it be Big Stone or other customers that we're developing projects with, we're very open to working with the engineering partners and design construction teams that they are comfortable utilizing as long as we can get comfortable around utilizing them. So was have we been dictated by any of our financing partners to say, hey, you have to use this firm? No, it's more of a question of you have to use a firm that you get your customer comfortable with and you get your financing partner comfortable with. And some of those can be a bridge, as we touched on earlier, where you have an owner's engineer who's brought on to kind of give credit to an execution strategy that maybe not as typical for the industry. So that is a gap of like, hey, I have a smaller engineering firm. I have a general contractor that's very regional to the area. They have a good balance sheet, but like they're not a household name. Then you can bring on an owner's engineer to really, I'd say, validate your project execution plan and saying like, hey, these aren't household names, but this firm's come on, they've talked to the leads, they've understood like all the FEL3 documents is usually what you're dealing with when you're proposing that and trying to get financiers on board, and that owner's engineer can bridge the gap of whatever execution strategy you're going to use. But I'd say we typically don't work with customers or financiers that are so fixated on a specific engineering partner or construction strategy that we can't find a point where, we're all comfortable with the partners that we're bringing onto a project.
Super helpful. Maybe last question on timing here for Court. Like, do you prefer to be brought in when you can introduce contractors with the FEL2 process, or is that a little bit more of like a hand holding that you're willing to do, but only if you don't have other deals closing? And would you almost rather sometimes see the kind of fully baked, like tick, check, tech, like all the finances of the balance sheets of each individual party here? How do you
Yeah. Yeah, great question. So, and I think maybe to explain a little bit more on new industrial. So you touched on it earlier about bringing in a project manager or an owner's rep on that side to manage development. That's actually my core function. So I'm not the financier. Devin, who was one of my other partners, would be dealing with that along with Matt on the infrastructure side. We like to be brought in about that 18 months from a financial close date. A lot of startups will think they're 6 months from a financial close or an FID date, which very quickly becomes 18. But really, the reason we want to be in there is to lead a team towards an outcome that works for them. One of the pitfalls we see in a lot of startups is, and it's not a slight on the people they bring onto their team, but you have a technology, you've hired really smart engineers to develop your proprietary technology as a startup. They aren't familiar with the contracting development world, nor should they be, and focused on that. So what ends up happening is that startup hires, a development lead into their team, which unfortunately they usually grab from another startup because they're looking for familiar names. And that's just not enough of a person that's been buried in that industry. We want to get in, and the first question I always get to is like, okay, what is at a high level the financing strategy we see moving forwards on for your project? If you have, some level of committed feedstock, so there's some price certainty around that for your initial feedstock coming in, and you can get some level of commitment of offtake or demonstrated demand for your product, that if it's a project finance model, it's like, okay, let's form a team, a design path that suits that model. because it's a very different path than a growth equity structure to build out a facility. And the two can lead very divergent paths, even though you'll get to the same spot. Under a project finance model, which is our big focus, what you're trying to do is eliminate that uncertainty both on cost and schedule. That's like kind of the focus all the way through, and that risk transfer associated with each contractor, engineer, all those components. So to the comment around, engineering firms for financing, it's like the balance sheet, that doesn't really matter. It's more on that risk transfer side of like an engineer can sign up to something, but if their limit of liability is their fee, and their fee is not even more than a couple percentage points of the overall capex, it's like, well, that doesn't do any good, right? So we want to be buried in early, because we do see a lot of startups will spend quite a bit of money on design, only they'll do it with a party that really can't support them through the next phase. I think that's on the one end on the financing. So we do want to be in that 12 to 18 month period for ourselves. A lot of our lenders or other equity providers that come in, that is at FID, and we've packaged the deal to a form where it's like, okay, now you can syndicate equity out. As a high level comment though, and this is where it's always a challenge with startups, we've been talking about developing your technology, refining items. Under a project finance model, it's like, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. If there's uncertainty on changing design, you are going to drag out your 12 to 18 month development process. You're going to spend a lot more money. You're going to have the engineers kind of running in different directions, and there's not certainty coming into your financial close. What does work is like making decisions and having to stay with them as long as they work. There might be a refinement you can do to make your facility a little bit more efficient, and sometimes you have to forego that initially just to close on it to get your project going. Because explaining that to engineers and technical minded people, you can get their buy into that. Lenders only see it as a downside risk of uncertainty around the deal. So if you're saying, well, we're going to change the design on this, that's to a lender saying, well, they may not hit commissioning, they might not get to revenue service, there's uncertainty on this, I might not get repaid, right? Like their risk is all downside. A lot of my job is actually just showing that, Sunil touched on scale up, that these are standard things that are being, increased in size or capacity. It's an off-the-shelf piece of equipment effectively from a specialty vendor. It's XYZ. To package it that a lender looks at it and says, there's not a lot of risk there. So that's really everything for our world comes back to how lenders view risk and equity views risk, and to structure it into a project finance model. And sometimes that's, making decisions that ultimately for your plant number two, or you may end up renovating the plant in the future to do those refinements too, you could do, but to get to close, you need to like draw a line in the sand.
Yeah. All right, let's talk numbers then. Because we keep talking about this like kind of downside risk transfer. Like I want to talk about to get to like, all right, the business of the EPCs. Sunil, you shared some really helpful data points about like where your business lives. What I'm going to kick off with a question. Maybe Sunil, you could start us off. Like, give us an example in layman's terms. Like, what happens when engineering isn't done well, or that design isn't locked in, or someone makes an engineering flaw that creates cost overruns? Like, practically, when they're working with these contractors or with a large EPC, what are the mechanisms in which those costs are paid for? Like you guys have referred to a couple different risk transfers here, and mitigating clauses, but like paint me a picture of how could it go bad? What are we actually talking about where maybe an engineer or some small engineering design firm is like on the hook for a mistake?
Right. So I think a lot of it depends on the contractual terms that have been agreed to, right? So, okay, let me speak from an EPC perspective because that's what I know. Reimbursable contracts, we get paid and we make money on effort hours. So, certain number of hours to do a task. It's we like that because it's the least risky for us. Now, if we do something wrong, to fix it is going to take more hours, and we'll keep charging the client those hours. So I guess in that scenario, it would be the owner who takes on a bulk of the cost overruns. Different contracting structures, lump sum. Now, if you're a client, you would give us a design basis and say, here's the plant we want built, give us a cost. We'll do work behind the scenes, we'll give you a cost, and they'll pay us for the cost, and we just deliver the project for that cost. In that scenario, if we do something wrong and there's cost overruns, it's on us to make up the cost. So and I was going to touch on that a little bit, because how we look at risk is very much dependent on certain factors. So for each project and each proposal that we put out, there's a risk profile associated with it. So it's dependent on the total install cost of what we're bidding on, the scope, is it an FEL 1, 2, 3, is it detailed engineering, the location, and then probably most importantly, it's the contracting type, whether it's reimbursable or lump sum. Those are kind of the two. There are models where you can sort of blend both. Like you can do open book conversion, which means that you're reimbursable through a certain percentage of engineering. Once you get firm pricing for equipment, you get firm pricing from subcontractors, then you can convert it to a lump sum. Or you can sort of piecemeal the different parts of the facility and say like, this balance of plant system, there's no risk or less risk, so we can do that lump sum, but other pieces, we can do that lump sum, and then the other pieces we can do reimbursable. So who pays for those cost overruns very much dependent on how those contracting structures, how they're defined early on in the project, and what sort of risk allocation everybody's willing to take up front.
Got it. Tom, drawing on your background, can you define a change order and a liquidated damage as part of these negotiating terms?
Yeah, so your change orders are going to be anything out of scope in a given proposal or contract that needs to be added into the scope. So that can be related to new scope being added. It could be related to just scope changes in the way that the project's being executed, saying, hey, we assume that this piece of equipment was going to be sufficient, and hey, there's been R&D developments, and hey, there's a step change in the amount of flow we need through from a pump, or the site layout has changed in a way that needs to be accounted for in the design and the construction of the site. So you will receive a change order from your EPC partner to formally accept that change. And you may find that you find changes cost more than you anticipated, or there might be a greater schedule impact because some of the change orders may just be schedule related. And you may decide, hey, that change isn't worth it, and we'll go through. Liquidated damages is more about typically tied to some substantial completion milestone in a project. So you can establish those in the contract with the EPC partner. It may be related to a design milestone to release procurement of an item. It may, but they're typically more tied to operational targets and turning things over to commercially viable. So in that way, it would be tied to, hey, we want 25% of the capacity to be achieved for a plant operation by this date, and there could be liquidated damages. Typically, those are tied to, and you got to be very careful on how you tie those, because there's usually a lot of prerequisites. If your EPC partner is sharp, they might say, hey, this assumes that the owner supplied equipment are available 6 months before the commercial operation date, and then if you don't fulfill your commitment, you may miss out on the chances for liquidated damages. I'd say they're really a sticking point with negotiating, especially a first of a kind technology. You want to be uh, aware of those trade-offs because a lot of contractors on their end, they're managing their risk profile. They may say, "Hey, we're willing to accept this, but we want some upside, being like, an early completion payout to kind of create an equal position where they have that." And being a startup, you just have to be very aware of, hey, what's the likelihood of the early completion? Are we missing something? Is this a lot easier than we thought if we're just sole sourcing to a firm and they're, very confident on hitting this date, and maybe it's not as complex as anticipated from the startup line. You can get yourself in a dangerous situation. So a lot of those are like liquidated damages should be informed by your early engineering studies and really understanding the full scope of what's required to execute.
Roger. Tom, maybe you can give us one last anecdote of like, how does that budgeting process internal at Antora work when you're navigating the tension of using potentially equity and VC dollars who honestly don't always really understand these processes and why you're spending money toward having, engineering or design firms that can help de-risk or transfer risk early versus waiting until these kind of FID decisions with some of the later lenders where this really all needs to be buttoned up. Can you talk to us about like when you are far, far pre-FID, right, in the FEL zeros, and you need to be allocating budget toward these activities and accounting for the cost overruns and the insurance amounts that might be required to start to approach, earning quartz time and working with development capital providers. How are you doing that internally? And like, what's some of your advice that you have for the founders in this room who might also be educating their VC and equity investors along the way?
Yeah, I think a lot of startups are a little bit hesitant to put like heavy processes in place and gates in place as an organization, but they're really required to be able to make sure that you're allocating resources appropriately in these FEL 0, FEL 1 stage. So establishing like, hey, this opportunity must meet, it must have an internal estimate developed. It must have an economic model that makes sense. It must have, potential partners or stakeholders that are interested in it and customers that are interested. And it must make sense in terms of what you're going to spend on that first gate of like, hey, we want to go out and engage in a firm on a FEL 0 or FEL 1 effort that might be in the tens of thousands of dollars. As you move further, you need to have additional gates. That really is dependent on what your cost curve looks like for a project development. For projects that have heavy electrical integration and might be power infrastructure projects, there can be lead times of long lead equipments upwards of a year or greater, and you must establish gates then of like how do we appropriately approve those financial commitments when we may be in the middle of a FEL 3 round and we may be uh, uh, courting court or other investors in that opportunity, but not have them fully on board. Is how do we appropriately assess the risk of, hey, we want to buy this long lead switchgear or transformer or other equipment to enable our quick execution strategy, but we may not have full certainty in the project. You need a way of gating that those major purchases, or maybe it's an award to an EPC that's a greater contract, but you're typically really focusing on driving down a risk registry at that point and keeping that an eye on that to make sure that you're mitigating the larger risks. You're presenting them clearly to the partners and as well as your leadership within the company and getting them through those phase gated steps. But if you don't have a process, then you're making every decision week to week ad hoc, and that becomes a really, I'd say, a huge a bear on your workforce of every time there's a decision to be made, you're looking at it as an individual decision versus in the phase gates of a process and having a really well defined, all right, this is what a go no go decision at this stage of a project looks like.
back to the talent piece and why everybody should be working with Court, frankly, or hiring Tom on their team. Um, uh, I Court, Sunil, give us a little bit of broad strokes. And let's talk about a few different magnitudes. Let's talk about call it a 50 to $100 million project and call it a $300 million project, right? Ballpark. What if I am a founder and I've raised enough growth equity to get me to some degree of development? What degree of development should I expect to be using fully equity for? Let's assume I can raise no development capital. And like, what are the general factors I should be estimating for this type of technical project development by paying my EPC, paying insurance, paying for all of the additional owner's engineers, or how should I be broad stroke budgeting for this entire work stream that we've been talking about?
I'm happy to go first if you want, Sunil.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So it's a great question because it's actually a lot of the times new industrial, we get involved prior to even a budget being approved to get to an FID decision. So a big part of what I do is try to broad strokes, what is required in building a development budget with that startup as well as a development schedule. It's not going to be perfect, but it's to kind of align the steps. And also all the key decision points on where you have to spend money, because that's very challenging for a lot of startups through there. My experience, and this doesn't change too much by the scale of the project, is if you're anticipating from your initial budget exercises you've done that it's a $100 million facility, I'll just pick on that. If you ignore any large scale equipment deposits, so if you have any specialty equipment that you need to put a 25% deposit to get into the queue to purchase, ignoring those because those are going to be project specific, I would anticipate you're going to spend about 2.5 to 5% of the total CapEx to get to a point where I can do a financial close and put debt and project equity into it. So a big part of what I do with a lot of our startups that we're working with and when we partnered with them is make sure they have sufficient cash flow to cover that to their financial close kind of target date or FID, depending on the terms you want to use. We use financial close because of project finance model. I make sure they have that. And the second part is I make sure they get that in front of their board and their investors. One of the big challenges that I see on every development, if you don't get ahead of it, pre-development has a path. It has a cadence that starts picking up and it intensifies as you get closer to FEL3. What can be a challenge is if with each of these payments, whether it's committing to a lease for a ground lease or a building to occupy, there's security packages, there's all these things that have to be considered and costs that the startup has to spend or engineering. And if a startup doesn't lock in with their board, they get stopped. Well, as Sunil probably can touch on, as an engineer, if you stop working with them for 3 months waiting for a board approval, he has to redeploy his engineers. They have to go somewhere. They need to be working all the time. And you lose that cadence, you lose that transfer of knowledge because suddenly you've lost maybe your key engineers on the project. So it's really making sure you're aligned on that budget you need to spend. Again, it's no crystal ball. It's not always going to be perfect, but for me, it's kind of shaked out in that 2.5 to 5% of what you anticipate is your total CapEx you're going to spend prior to financial close of a project. So, Sunil, anything to add on that or challenge?
So in my head, that sounds like what are you going to spend up through feed on a project, and that your number is right on with what I was thinking, that 2.5 to 5%. So yeah, I would agree with that.
Super helpful. That, be a good partner and don't kind of this cadence piece of not just timing, but don't start stop. That's also a really important comment I appreciate. I'm gonna come to you guys with a little bit of maybe some rapid fire questions here. What do you think is the one term that a founder or early stage project should be asking for and should be adamant about in negotiating with these EPC contracts? Court, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I hate to nuance it. It depends on the structure you're looking to finance it. If you're looking to do a project finance model, you need to work out terms where ultimately you are capping your risk in some capacity across all different streams. So, you know, I'll pick on the five major ones. We'll start with your technology on the process risk side. Contractors are not going to take that. Like, especially for a first of kind facility, there's options you can do around that. You can work with entities like New Energy Risk or Munich on the process risk engineering and look at options. You got to be careful on those term sheets. Or you can put money aside to it. Ultimately, the best way to de-risk that is by limiting your scale up risk. We touched on earlier, if it's just 10 pieces of the same equipment you have running your pilot plant, that's really easy to scale, right? People can get comfortable with that. So that's on the process side. The second big one is always going to be schedule, and this gets kind of split to me into two parts. It's your schedule. We've been talking about owner supplied equipment. Tom, I think, touched on that pretty heavily, that this isn't purely turnkey. If there's owner supplied equipment, it needs to be on site. That blows any schedule LD risk transfer right back to the owner. So you need to define out what that looks like in your contract and how that's going to play through. The other portion of schedule risk is, okay, balance a plan. You're doing the rest of the work associated with the project. To me, that's a big one that should sit with the contractor, because they are best placed to do that. They are best placed to handle all the ancillary life safety systems, all the other components around it, as long as you defined it for them. You don't want to have a team that's trying to manage that through. So schedule and how that risk plays through, we won't go into the financial security package to back that up here, but that is, to me, kind of fundamental of an EPC or design build agreement, is some level of certainty around your schedule for the portions the contractor is in control of. The third part is really getting into design integration. And this kind of plays back into the concept of change orders and the caps on risk. During your pre-FID financial close, your vendors, your equipment vendors, are probably doing some design work as well that you're paying for. And you might be carrying that as an owner, but the design integration risk of their equipment into your facility, the design of the remainder of the facility, is important to sit with the contractor if you're using this contract model. This isn't a perfect risk transfer, because fundamentally, if you went from 2 decanters to 3 suddenly because your vendor screwed up, I wouldn't blame Sunil for coming at me with a change order. Like, that's going to be on me. But you also don't want to be dying in okay, well, the connection's over here, so that's going to run a little bit more wire. It's like, no, that's what you're trying to avoid. You're ultimately trying to get to a level that when you're sitting down, it's like you have to treat it over all the terms that you can walk through and say, these are all the major risks to the risk register idea. Here's the mitigants. Those mitigants can be either it's transferred contractually to this entity, it's transferred to this person, we've done this extra design work for this to make sure this is covered, or we're carrying money for this. Like, you actually assign a bucket of money that you think is appropriate for that and have to justify that through. So to me, those were the first 3 things you need in your terms. The fourth is then, okay, to address those 3, what does that security package look like? There's lots of things from bonding to parent company guarantees. Both, are great, but also present challenges of a parent company guarantee you have to sue. A small startup suing a large company is quite challenging, and you run into a cash flow issue. So it's like, are you looking at to address liquidated damages? And I saw a question earlier about liquidated damages. The most common one we see there is for debt repayment, because ultimately the debt service starts at a contemplated date in the financial model. That typically runs at minimum your interest rate that is associated with your debt divided by 365 is like the simplest way to get a rough sense of how much that's going to cost. And that doesn't address equity, that doesn't address other costs. But you're looking at the security package, it's like, well, okay, the contractor says they can do this. Did they provide a guarantee on some company level? Is that a subsidiary holding company that has nothing in their organization? Is it the top co-parent? Did they provide a liquid security in the form of a letter of credit to cover a portion of that? That's usually a sticking point for contractors, but it becomes an important one because it's cash that immediately becomes available. And I'd say the sort of last part of that contractual negotiation is really coming down to your supervening event change order language. What does that all look like? What can the contractor say this is not our fault for? I can spend an hour and a half going through a different list of what that could look like, so I won't do that here. But that list of, okay, what can the contractor be like? Sorry, this isn't our responsibility. This blows up X, Y, Z. And so you need to really focus on those components as you build through if you're going to use this type of contract model. Because if you don't address those appropriately, you're kind of back to just doing a construction management contract or, a design bid build style contract, which is cheaper on capex, but not necessarily cheaper on an overall project life, in terms of how you structure the debt and every other component on it. So, and frankly, for a lot of startups, not feasible because they just can't raise money on it. So
That was very helpful and comprehensive. I was like furiously taking notes. You can correct me if I misstated anything on the side, but also for the room to follow those kind of 5 buckets. I mean, in some ways, without like the Toms of the world embedded, who have been in the EPCs and kind of know what it means to be a good partner, how to keep up the cadence, like what to push for, what's most important, where you as a technology company can say, yes, we're willing to take on that process risk, and we're going to go find the new energy risks out there to help us back that up. Sunil, tell me what bad looks like in negotiations. Like how could, I'm going a little off script here, so I'm asking Sunil to think on his feet, but like where do negotiations kind of fall apart when founders are trying to push for too much here, and what are better partnerships really made of?
Um, I guess, historically we do see a lot of, hey, the EPC will take the full wrap, the EPC wrap. I saw that there was a question earlier about what that means. Um, we're not going to, that means all the risks that court just listed, that means all that's going to be on the EPC essentially. And that's not something that makes a lot of sense for us, especially on the performance side, performance of the technology. We don't want to take any risk on that, if it's not our technology. Schedule, integration, those types of things. I think we're more open to taking some risk there, and agreeing to LD caps, right? I mean, it's not going to be unlimited. It's going to be capped at something. So I think this is the hard part about this, right? Is like everybody wants to take on less risk and kind of push risk to other parties, but everyone's got to take on some amount of risk. So, I mean, what looks bad is when the contractual terms are not fair and balanced in our eyes, and we've had to. This isn't specific to climate, but we've had to walk away from projects where they awarded it to us, but we couldn't come to terms and conditions. We couldn't. The negotiations on the contract didn't work out, and we've had to walk away, and that's unfortunately. I mean, we're a publicly traded company. We have to protect shareholder value. So, better to have no contract than a bad contract is what someone told me once, and I think that's very, very true. So I think we want it to be fair and balanced, and we're willing to negotiate for that. And if we have to walk away, unfortunately, we've done that in the past.
Tom's coming off mute. I'm sure he's got some maybe anti-case studies of when these things have fallen apart, or maybe Tom, you have some wise words about what risk should founders anticipate they absolutely need to take on? Like, how are you making those judgment calls when in the earlier days of Antora? I know you guys are more in repeatability stages at this point, which is like the graduation everyone hopes for. But talk to us more about like how founders should make those trade-offs when they're negotiating.
Yeah, I think one thing is just fundamental when you look at it is have a strategy of EPC engagement that makes sense for the size of your project and the maturity of your project. Meaning, Fluor and Sunil made the comment before that they might not be the right partner for a fell zero for a $5 million pilot project. You may work with another partner, validate your technology, and then bring on a tier one or large EPC firm as the owner's engineer in that early study. And the benefit of viewing this as a two-stage problem of like early development engineering and then later like this larger EPC partnership is that you're using the right partner for each problem and kind of right sizing them. You want your partner to be motivated, engaged, and like really interested in being a partner, not just for the current opportunity, but to partner with you going forward and having those motivations. And part of that, I'd say, is letting them see a little bit behind the curtain in terms of what the risks of the project are. You don't want to hide those and then have them come out midway through execution and be in a position where your partner all of a sudden is exposed to something that they didn't know they were getting into. The way you want to look at it is be transparent on your risk going into that, so that they can partner with you, address them adequately, and maybe make some changes or modifications to the execution strategy to de-risk those rather than hiding them, letting them fester and turn into larger problems. So I think when you talk about bringing on a larger EPC and getting that contract position, I view it as like, first of all, you want a partner that you know is going to sign up to complete the job and complete it through turnover to operations in a timeline and costs that meet your financiers. You don't want to negotiate a deal where they're going to feel that they're have been misled during that process. So I think those terms, especially when you're looking at the initial engagement, you want to really entice your partner. You want to make that a long-term partnership. And yes, that kind of counteracts some of the motivations to lower cost and lower and have harder terms on those contracts. But if you're open and honest to the things that are important to you, whether it's a schedule-driven project, whether it's really like cost is the number one thing for the contract, or is it the number one thing that, hey, we want a quality product in a long-term life cycle product and project that has low OpEx, and we're meeting our OpEx so that this project pencils to do 20 more. That and a lot of times is the end goal of the financier, and everybody should be motivated around is that full product life cycle that Court was mentioning. That might be the most important metric when you really take a step back, and it may not be as important to negotiate really strict EPC terms and make sure their margins are low and their LDs are really high. That might not actually achieve what your end goal is.
I would just layer onto that, Tom, because you hit a really good point on, from my perspective, like, 'cause I deal with this on every single startup we've worked on. A lot of the startups will get really hung up on even the contractor's fee. And I'm like, it almost becomes a rounding error in the grand scheme of these projects. Really, it comes down to fundamentally that partnership with the contractor of like, this is the number that pencils that we can get financing and we can do this, or it doesn't. And do I care if you made a whole bunch more money or not? To a certain level, I don't. And I know that sounds really counterintuitive. It's like you should be pinching every dollar. But for many startups, like your first facility is your first demonstration that you are viable at a commercial scale. If you're using a project finance model where equity is coming from external sources, it's not even growth equity through your top co, so you're not diluting yourself. The whole goal is repeatability. So I look at companies where, Fluor might not be interested in my $25 million facility in Texas because it's a little too small for them. But the company I'm working with has so many off takes that I might be able to convince them, hey, let's do this as a partnership because I'm going to be starting 3 of these next year. We're going to plug all the equity in. We're going to do this. Yes, we have a long pre-con with this first one, but the rest are just replicas, and you're just going to have to change the foundations for geotechnical conditions and some minor permitting variances. But that becomes a lot more appetizing of a model. So it's like people shouldn't lose the forest through the trees on what that looks like. And even on a budget phase, you see startups will challenge budgets. And like until it's a firm price, honestly, it doesn't really matter. So don't fight over $100,000 in a multiple million dollar contract at a budget phase. If 6 months get burned, that's gone in escalation alone, right? So like people just have to focus on like, does this work in my financial model that I can do the deal or not? And am I working with somebody I trust, have a good relationship with, and can help me grow and expand my business as I have more business needs? Because I think for everyone on this call, that's the goal. It's not one facility, it's 10, it's 20, right? So that's where we're trying to always focus is get across that line.
Super valuable commentary from everyone. I appreciate the banter. We're getting a question in the chat about like, all right, walk it back a few stages. If you're talking to companies at the very earliest innings of thinking about bringing hard tech kind of out of national laboratories, university laboratories, like my answer to the question of how early should they be thinking about this and what can they be doing to set the foundation for it? I think one of the clear threads between this chat was that risk mitigation and transfer and quantification is a huge component of everything that gets done here. And in the project development process, creating the risk matrix and communicating that risk matrix to all of the parties involved is actually a startup counterintuitive thing where like vision has been sold to equity investors and risk is the thing that you like try to sneak into a few bullet points at the board meeting and it's like not really brought into the daylight. This is the opposite muscle that needs to be built for courting project investors, working with EPCs and kind of managing that sharing over time. I'd be curious in rapid fire, maybe Court, Tom, Sunil, what would be your answer to that question? What do you wish was being laid at the foundation at the earliest stages of company formation for success in this domain?
Yeah, so I think for us at New Industrial, we're really focused once there is a pilot plant and we're trying to build more commercial scale. So we're kind of past the lab phase. One of the big things for me before making even an investment decision to invest in their topco is partnered companies being transparent on what they still need to figure out, what they're not going to know everything. They're obviously not buried across the development. I'm hoping they actually haven't worked with Sunil and the team yet because I want to be part of that from day one. But it's, be honest about what is still missing from your technology, what isn't there, because that's what I'm going to go through and evaluate. And so if I see, there's the bullish, I'll call it American startup founder that is like, everything's perfect. It's the best product. It's this X, Y, Z. And I'm Canadian. So like, that's just not how we really operate. Immediately red flags go to me of like, okay, where are the hidden bodies in this? Because making our top co-investments one thing, you can momentum trade on that for the VC startup side of the world. But ultimately, I'm not going to put project equity into something that I don't think is hashed out. And that's our bigger check, right? Like we make a modest investment in the VC side. When you look at a project, if it's under a project financing model, you've got 35 to 40% of that is going to be in equity. So a $100 million facility is a 35 to $40 million equity check that's going in there. And a pref equity structure, and we'll work through that. But that's 20 times our initial investment in the VC side. So there is this level of diligence. It's just being honest of what you have sorted out, what you haven't sorted out, and what your plan is to sort those missing technology pieces out. The rest we can help with, like the structuring of the contracts, what's the best approach. And we'll be very transparent with somebody about, hey, you don't have offtakes. This isn't going to really hit a project finance model. You can get other private credit, you can do other functions, and we can support that if we're really interested, but it's going to change your model. And that's okay. But we see a lot of founders will kind of exaggerate in the early phases of both their technology development and then their commercial demand for their product in the form of offtakes. So just being open and transparent at that phase, if you're looking for an equity development partner, is a very different approach than maybe you did with your VC raises. I think that answers the question. I kind of went on a tangent there. So
Appreciated. No, it was helpful. Tom, rapid fire.
Yeah, so I think when you're first getting that engagement going and you're looking to execute a project, I think it's back to the basics, but it's something that's really critical is just have a project charter and have your leadership in your company sign off on what the project is. Like, what's the schedule you're looking to achieve? What's the CapEx, the OpEx goals? What are the key KPIs that you need to hit? What's going to trigger the next round of spending? You're about to invest a lot of human capital, your resources, engaging with these external partners. You're going to spend a lot of money and time engineering with partners. Make sure you're all on the right page going into that, because I think a lot of there's always a focus on speed to execution, and Antora certainly has that. But you're only able to achieve that if everybody's on the right page on what the project looks like from the get-go, and what is needed to be successful. So risk register and a great on you on highlighting that. But that project charter should include, hey, your major risks that need to be resolved before the company's starting to spend a lot of capital on this opportunity. So have that charter, have it actually signed off and approved by leadership. It really prevents everybody from going in different directions, and provides a source of truth that can be really relied on early in the project, and update it as soon as you get to these different gates through the process. It's really critical to making sure you stay on track.
Awesome. All right. This has been an amazing session. Thank you all for your contributions, and thanks for everyone for sticking around. In the last 30 seconds we have here, I'm going to hold you each to 2 to 3 words, 15 seconds each, true lightning fire round. Of the startups out there, what is the single biggest indicator that founder or company should use an EPC? Sunil, let's start with you.
2 words.
Yeah.
Gosh, that's hard. I think if your project is complex, if you're going to scale and it's going to be very large, I think working with an EPC can be beneficial even in those early stages.
Brilliant. Court?
If you have the commercial offtakes and feedstock arrangements to do a project-based financing model. If you're in the other world where you don't have that, and that's okay, but you're going to use private credit, maybe think twice on using an EPC. But if you're in a scenario with project finance, that's definitely the first indicator. While you pay a premium for an EPC, you ultimately save that on your financing.
Great point. All right. Tom?
Design maturity and capital intensive project. If you have those combinations, I think you're ready.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us, Court, Tom, Sunil. Your insights were invaluable. Catch everybody next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.